Outlander is a historical drama slash romance slash sci-fi novel, and now a TV series, set mostly in the Scottish Highlands, featuring an English woman who is transported back in time from 1945 to 1743 when the series starts. Now of course, if you know anything about history, you'll realise that this date is just 2 years before the start of the 1745 Jacobite Rising, and the series does indeed cover the Jacobite Rising of 1745 at great lengths in several episodes, so I thought I'd have a look at this, and specifically at its portrayal of the Jacobite Army. Now obviously Outlander is a TV series with I think 2-3 seasons at the moment, so there's obviously a lot of footage to go through, but I've specifically selected episode 10 from season 2, which is entitled Prestonpans, so the start of the rebellion. And if you guys really do enjoy this one, then let me know in the comments below, and I might do the same for the next episode in the line, which is sort of the middle phase of the rebellion, and the one after that, which is covering the Battle of Cuillin. So, does Outlander accurately portray the Jacobite Risings? Let's take a look. So, first of all, just to highlight, this is obviously set to 1743, although this episode is 1745. So the Jacobite Risings, there are several ones, but this one is only looking at the 1745 Rising and the historical accuracy within that. First of all, I have to say I was quite impressed with the portrayal of the army in general, especially the one that Jamie commands before they meet up with the larger army, because often you have the kind of romantic image of the Jacobite army where they're all wearing beautiful tartans and emplate, they've all got blue bonnets on with the nice white cocards, they're all carrying targes and muskets and broadswords, and they all look, you know, like the classic romantic image of a Highlander, whereas probably the majority of the Highland section of the Jacobite armies throughout the rebellions would have been poor people. And this is because of the Highland clan system and how this worked. So at the top of the clan system you had the chief, so like Colin Mackenzie is an example of a chief there. He would have under him the taxmen who would go out and collect the taxes and the rents from the subtenants. Then there would be subtenants to those subtenants, and at the very bottom of the pile you had the cotters. And obviously it's a pyramid system, so you only have one chief, you have a few taxmen, then more subtenants to the subtenants, and people who basically own less and less and are reliant on the people further up in the chain. And obviously the cotters, if the chief says, or he would get his taxmen to go out and enforce it, that I want your sons to come out and join the Highland army, then that's what they would do. And the chief would provide them with weapons, or if he didn't, then they would be using their farming implements, and you can really see that here with how they've come dressed as well in the poorer clothing. I think that's an accurate portrayal of what the army would have looked like, or large parts of the Highland army from the Highlands specifically. As well, I quite enjoyed the distinction between these various groups of the clan system within the army. So obviously you have Angus and his friend there. They are from a higher one, so I think they're probably taxmen. If they're not taxmen, they'll probably be better off subtenants, and they are the ones who go around and they collect the rents from the tenants, so I'm pretty sure they're the taxmen in the clan. And they obviously are a bit better armed, they have broadswords, they both have targes as well, and they really have a different kind of interaction with the cotters. But what I did have to say is that I really enjoyed this scene, which is obviously after the Battle of Prestonpans, where they've both lost a friend, and that makes them sort of equal in each other's eyes, because Angus will say, "Oh, don't run off," and they didn't run. And that's kind of where that comes from. So I thought that was a really nice scene, and it was a good look at the Highland clan system and the social structure of the army, really, that related to the clan system that was effectively in place until after the Battle of Culloden, when the Duke of Cumberland and the British Army to a great extent destroyed the clan system and that way of life, for better or for worse. One thing I would comment on the Battle of Prestonpans as it's portrayed in Outlander is that you see in the battle scene, and quite correctly actually, that they take off the larger part of the filler more, which is, you obviously have the kilt, which is the lower part, but you also have the kind of strap, if you will, of the tartan that goes over the shoulder, and this is called the filler more, is the larger tartan in Gaelic. But they did accurately take that off. You see them taking the top part off so that they can run unencumbered. But one thing I did notice was that not a lot of them were carrying targes when they had broadswords. So as I explained earlier, there were many poorer men, but you see a lot of the main characters. So you see what's his face, Colum's brother, you see charging in, Dougal, with a broadsword but no targe. I would expect there to be a lot more targes, the shields, as this was their only real method of defense, and as they were such a melee minded attacker, then they would really need something to defend themselves with, especially against the bayonets. And as well, we have accounts of people. I think there was a gentleman in Perth who was employed by the Jacobite army. We still have the records, and he made hundreds and hundreds of targes. And targes, they were a bit more in the higher end of what people could afford, but we know that there was that guy, and there were probably many more who were employed by the Jacobites to make targes for their army. This one actually in the bottom right is the special targe of Bonnie Prince Charlie himself, Charles Edward Stuart, with some very fascist looking insignias on there. I wonder if he knew that. Anyway, and the one in the top left corner is from a higher up earl, but you could also make a charge just with 4 different planks of wood in the right formation and going grain against each other, and potentially even putting leather on the outside if you wanted to make it a bit stronger. So it wasn't that expensive to make, so I would have expected a few more of those, but that's a bit of a nitpick. And then again, you do see in this image here, Jamie clearly has a targe. There are targes around, it's just I would have expected to see a couple more there, although that's not really a massive thing. Of course, you could argue this was just the part of the battle that they were showing without that many targes. So I actually thought the battle itself was really close to the historical details that we know about the Battle of Prestonpans. So first of all, when they have the bog between each other, them and the British camp, this actually was the case before the Battle of Prestonpans, and it was also the case that the Jacobites at 4 a.m. in the morning went on this march to go sort of around the bog or through a pass through the bog to reach the other side and then charge into the British camp starting around 6 a.m. I think. The only small difference between how it's portrayed in Outlander and how it was in real history is that there wasn't a farmer's son who comes and tells them about that like there is in the show, but it was actually one of the generals of the Jacobite army, was born and raised right around Prestonpans, and he knew the way through the marshy bog that was there, so he was the one who led them through. Other than that, I think it's very accurate, sort of the kind of surprise attack through the mist, attacking that position there. I thought that was really well done. Now, another thing that I really enjoyed and think they do really well actually in Outlander is showing kind of the distinction between the aims of the actual soldiers in the Highland army and the Jacobite army and Bonnie Prince Charlie himself. You see obviously this scene with Dougal where he's coming in and threatening the British, sharp contrast to the prince asking Jamie to ask his wife to care for the British wounded before he cares for the Jacobite wounded, because he felt obviously that he was the king of both the subjects of England and Scotland, and that was his aim. So there is an interesting distinction there, that whether people were supporting the Jacobites to make Scotland an independent nation. Now, it's very difficult to say. There's very many different reasons why people supported the Jacobites, and some quite opposite reasons which are interesting. Or whether it was just that the Jacobites were kind of the ones causing a fuss, they were the kind of rebels, so that's what people latched onto to show their discontent, whether they were actually supporting the Jacobites themselves, or rather they were just against the Hanoverian British/English government in connection with Scotland, is quite a big issue, and I think the show does well to show that kind of distinction. Now, of course, a lot of the people fighting for the Jacobites were against the Act of Union, which was in 1707, essentially brought England and Scotland together into one nation. Many of the Jacobites themselves wanted Scotland to be independent of England in so much as that they'd have their own parliament and would be able to decide their own laws. Now, that had been changed in 1707 under Queen Anne. However, whether many of them wanted Scotland to go fully independent again is difficult to say, although clearly the Bonnie Prince doesn't want that to happen. He wanted to capture the London, because London was the seat of the British government, and he really just wants to put himself and his family, the Stuarts, onto the British throne rather than making Scotland an independent nation or trying to secede from England or anything like that. He simply wants to march down, and that's why he marched into England. He'd captured large parts of Scotland, Inverness, Edinburgh, not the castle, Perth, for example. He'd all captured these cities in Scotland, so it wasn't so much that he was invading to make Scotland a free country, it was he was invading through Scotland to then go on to England, to London, and to become the king of England, Scotland and Ireland nominally. And this is an interesting distinction that you see with him trying to win over the English, because that's one of his main aims, is that when he comes through Scotland, he knows in the Highlands he's got a lot of support. The Lowlands less so, because the people were more Presbyterian, they were more in favour. but he thinks in northern England, in areas like Northumberland, Lancashire, and south-western England as well, Cornwall, there are many Catholics. It's not clear-cut this religious distinction, but he knows that he hopes that he's going to get support there, which is why he says 10 for the English first, because then he's hoping to win them on side to show I am your king and that they'll come to his cause. But the Scottish, they are completely the other side of that. A lot of them wouldn't have been fighting for that reason. In fact, I think a lot of the Highland clans who went on, really, a lot of them, especially lower down, maybe some of the higher up chiefs did grasp the higher political situation, but I think a lot of them just went because it was like a big cattle raiding expedition. If they won, they would get a lot out of it, that kind of thing. Maybe a bit cynical, but I think the show does well as well in their portrayal of Bonnie Prince Charlie, and especially the War Council. Now, the War Council is very fractious in the show, arguments between some of the major leaders, and I think this was one of the main reasons that Bonnie Prince Charlie's campaign ultimately failed in 1745, because of the fractious nature of the council. And the two main council members here, also shown in the show very well, are John O'Sullivan and Lord George Murray. And these two were actually his biggest really advisors. And on a quick reading of history, you kind of associate that John O'Sullivan was the bad commander and Lord George Murray was the good commander. But when you read more into it, you get a much more complex picture. For example, John O'Sullivan was an Irishman, but he'd gone out into French service to fight under the French, who had an Irish regiment at the time, the Irish Brigade, and he actually fought at the Battle of Fontenoy in 1745. And this was actually, for once, a French victory against the British and their allies. And it's also one of the reasons that the French didn't invest as much into the Jacobite Rising of 1745, because Fontenoy had been such a great victory. They didn't need the kind of decoy that the Jacobite Rising turned out to be to function as well. And this obviously meant, because he had served with the French, a professional army, and fought against the British, that he had really good understanding and experience of commanding an actual army, a working 18th century army with firearms, artillery, cavalry, and that does come across in the show. However, of course, the army that Bonnie Prince Charlie had did have those elements. He did at one point get artillery. He also had regiments that defected from the government, and in the lowlands he had some really quite professional units of men that joined his cause, as well as cavalry that were raised from the lowlands. But not all of his army was like that, and the other commander, Lord George Murray, had a much better understanding of how to use and fight with a Highland army, which was a large part of the Jacobite army, especially when he first landed. So at Prestonpans, mostly there were Highlanders there supporting him, because he'd just come through the Highlands, which was where he had many clans who were loyal to him. And he had a much better idea of how these fought. So for example, when they're arguing about going through the bog, he understands that being bogged down with a Highland charge is the end of a Highland charge, which is one of the main reasons it failed at Cuillin. Now, he himself had actually also fought, but this time with the British when he was a young man. I think he joined up when he was 18 in the early 1700s, and he had fought in Flanders. But in 1715, when he heard there was a Jacobite Rising in Scotland, he and his brothers left and joined the Jacobite Rising, and so he had experience fighting there, as well as in the 1719 rebellion, which is little less known, although I'll make a video about that at some point in the future. So he had a good military understanding as well, but from a very different kind of perspective than John O'Sullivan. And also you see a very interesting distinction in this council between the Irish Jacobites who were there. He had several prominent Irishmen who were in support of him, and the Scottish Jacobites who were representing a larger part of the army. Now the Irish, what they wanted was, like what Bonnie Prince Charlie wanted, was to retake the thrones of England and Scotland, which he would do through Scotland and into England, and then Ireland was attached to that, because the Irish obviously were being persecuted because of their Catholic belief, which adds another religious dimension to the conflict. And they really hoped that if Bonnie Prince Charlie came to the throne, the Stuarts had always flirted with Catholicism, and they were less repressive towards Catholics than the current regime, which especially in Ireland, they weren't happy with at all. So really what John O'Sullivan wanted was for the Stuarts to get back onto the throne, and then to take over England, Scotland and Ireland as the king of all three, and then lessen the restrictions on Catholics. Whereas the Scots, what they were more hoping was for the Bonnie Prince obviously to win, for Scotland to become more independent, whether completely or not, probably not completely, but they wanted him to be their king, And really what they wanted was the repeal of the Act of Union of 1707. So there were different goals, and a lot of the Scots who fought for Bonnie Prince Charlie were Protestant Episcopalian, which was another distinction, but I'm going to have to make a video about all of this because it's incredibly complicated, and I'm trying to simplify it here. But there's also another tactical disagreement which I think shows the different characters of John O'Sullivan and Lord George Murray, which is where John O'Sullivan says, "Since when did a Scotsman shy away from a bit of mud, especially when there's an enemy waiting for him on the other side?" And to that, Lord George or Jamie even replies, "Since when does an Irish-born officer dismiss the dangers of boggy ground to an infantry assault?" Again, looking at the different sort of ideas of how one would fight. Of course, John O'Sullivan thinking more with a professional army, whereas realistically they didn't have a completely professional army at Prestonpans. It was more a Highland army with all of the cotters and different sorts of troops, melee-minded infantry. As well, I think that the show accurately, or fairly accurately in one way, portrays Bonnie Prince Charlie because there's so much romanticism around him. You can hear in many of the songs by the Corries, for example, sort of all singing his praises, and you can see in many of the portraits as well, it's the Bonnie Prince Charlie, you know, he's just this young lad, this gallant hero, and all the these big burly Highlanders are all sort of, you know, fighting for him, that kind of thing. And it's very easy to get carried away in that myth, you know, that this kind of romantic lost cause. Whereas really one could easily view him as being really an idiot, because he made some incredibly stupid decisions. He wasn't well prepared. He arrived in Scotland with hardly any men, not a great plan. He had hardly any tactical knowledge or experience at all, and he tried to conquer a kingdom and lost. And not only did he lose, you know, thousands of men were killed because of him, but the whole Highland clan system was utterly destroyed, and the Highlands were ravaged by British troops. And I think it took a long time for the Highlands to become as populated, because after the Risings, many of the Highlanders who'd fought for him had their land confiscated, many of them were left to die out in the cold, and hundreds of thousands emigrated from the Highlands and were replaced instead with sheep and crofters. So that's one very cynical view, and I think the show goes more in that direction, that he's kind of this pompous fool, which I think there is definitely merit to. It definitely doesn't fall into the trap of over-romanticising him. Maybe it goes a bit far in the other direction. I think perhaps he deserves a bit more credit than he gets in the show. But as well, if you look at what he's wearing, they've clearly gone after that kind of aesthetic. They've clearly looked very well at the source material. And I think they generally did a very good job in his portrayal. I'm not so sure about what Jamie's wearing here with what Jamie's wearing here with this kind of leather fashion, but all in all, I think they did a very good job at portraying this. Alright everyone, so this has been a very rambly video. Honestly, I don't know if many people have made it this far, but if you have, I don't know, right, thank God in the comments. So thank you very much for watching. This has been my video on the episode of Outlander. It's been more of a ramble about the Jacobite Risings, if I'm honest, but it's something that really interests me, and ever since making that Highlander video and seeing that people were interested in this kind of thing, I thought, well, why not? You know, it's one of the earliest periods of history that interested me, and so I've come up with quite a bit of knowledge on it down the years, and I'll probably make some more in the future. So thank you very much for watching. I have been History with Hilbert, and I hope you all have an excellent day.